welcome everyone to our research conversation. So I'm delighted that everyone is here. My name, for those who don't know me, is Phil Macnaghten. I'm a geographer here. And I would just like to say a little bit about the structure of the day and what are sort of hopes and objectives for the day. But first of all, I would like to thank very much our speakers for coming to this event. For those who are not aware, there are 3 speakers from Lancaster, which I feel is, and this is intentional. I spent 13 very happy years at Lancaster, and I feel intentionally guilty that it's taken me 6 years to invite my friends over. So I'm delighted that you're here. And then, as well as this, John Urry, who's and Bron Szysinski, who's here, and Catherine, yourself, Catherine, yeah, great, and Nigel Clark. And although Nigel's not from Lancaster, I always feel his heart is half there. He sort of feels like a Lancaster sort of person. So just before I'd just like to thank a few more people. So this event is sponsored by the Institute of Advanced Studies, so that's tremendous, and by the Lived Material Cultures cluster in geography. So it's tremendous that they've enabled this to take place. This is part of a series of events. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I would like to thank Matthew Kearns, Matt, for co-organising this event, and the wider IAS team, especially Sarah Banks, who's here, as well as a number of others. So I just want to say a little bit about today and how it's structured, what our thinking is for the day. So to begin with, I'm going to talk for half an hour or so, setting out a kind of a rationale and a context for how this idea has come about of thinking about the need for new storylines for living with environmental change. So I'm going to say a few words on that. And then we have a duet. We have John and Nigel, who will be leading the morning session. And what we have is that we have 25, half an hour for each speaker. And after that, there'll be a chance to ask a few questions. But what I'm really hoping is that after that, we'll have time to begin to think through some questions, which I'll just highlight here. So these are the questions which hopefully will kind of percolate through the day, and we'll be thinking through these questions, both in terms of how we listen to the various presentations, but also in terms of the kinds of discussions that we'll be having in the individual tables and what we present back. So I just mention these now because I think these are quite significant. So is there a rationale for needing new storylines for living with environmental change? Where do they come from? How will they be sustained? How will they be energized? And I think at this stage it's important to note that this is part of a wider series of activities which involve an innovative form of, as yet, rather amorphous, unformed public engagement. And the idea is, how can we co-produce new storylines for environmental change with local public? So that's an element that we'll be returning to throughout the day as well. So how can innovative public engagement form the process? How can social thought inform it? And how can this sort of help create different kinds of research agendas? So these are the questions which I just want you to glance at now, but we'll be returning to them throughout this morning's discussion.
And they're on the back page of the handout.
And they're on the back page of the handout. Okay. So we have, as I've mentioned, two speakers who are going to be talking in the morning, and then we'll be opening it up for discussion, and then starting to reflect on these questions in our table discussions. Hopefully have time for a good lunch, a duet after lunch, Bron and Catherine, and again the same kind of format, a way of actually having some time to engage with the speakers directly and then returning to these questions. And we'll have bits of flip chart paper as well, so people can scribble on them. And at the end of this session, we'll be presenting back. So someone from each of the tables will be presenting back to the entire group. Tea, and then we'll be thinking through what are the implications of this for the way we should think about citizen engagement. So that's basically the plan. So are there any questions about that, or does that seem sufficiently coherent at this stage? Yeah? Okay, great. Good, okay, and just to note that this is the start of a series of events. I'd like to say at this stage that Bron is going to be our fellow, our IAS fellow, who's going to be around for a lot of the autumn and interacting with us, not least in some of these events. So in terms of our calendar events, we have a large kind of event both for members of the public and the university on the 14th of November. So hopefully this might be of interest to some people here. And then what we have is a set of sort of kind of intellectual engagement. So we've got a couple of workshops, one on myth, the other on notions of locality and nature. And we'll be bringing all this back into a policy seminar later on. So just to indicate that there's a series of events which will be taking place between now and next summer, and these will be well publicised, and we might talk a little bit through the particulars of this later on. Okay, so that's, as it were, some of the practicalities. What I'd like to do now is to talk a little bit about why we've set up this event in the way that we have. So why do we talk about new storylines for living with environmental change? And I think there's there's perhaps three important reasons why we're interested in this question. So I think the first one is to do with current climate policy negotiations, the idea that we've perhaps witnessed little progress, that current framings are not as successful as they should be. A policy consensus has emerged, but this is not necessarily brought about the coordinated political action that's required. And there, of course, are multiple explanations, but the one which I'd like people to think through here is that maybe is to do with the framing of climate policy as a single governing, coherent and enforceable thing, which might be the problem. So there's something about framing here that might be of interest. In terms of behaviour change programmes, similarly, we perhaps have not seen the progress that we might have hoped for or imagined, certainly in terms of state-sponsored programmes. And we are, as John Urry will tell us, firmly addicted to high-carbon lifestyles. And perhaps one way to think about those addictions and lock-ins and embedded is really to do with how the whole issue has been framed. So framing, I think, is one aspect. You can see I've gone visual, so I apologise. I read this book, The Zen of Presentation, so this is an experiment. I don't know if it's going to work or not. You could tell me or not whether it's not. Okay, so it's to do with the framing of the debate. And again, as John tells us, up to now, there are two sets of actors who have been dominant. There are the climate scientists who tell us the facts, as it were, of climate change, who predict the scale and impact of future changes. And there are the economists, the dismal economists who tell us about the impacts. And again, as John said, the sciences and economics have got there first, and this has led to the neglect of wider disciplinary inputs, in particular politics and sociology. So this has led to some extent to de facto silencing of political debate regarding how to respond to climate change in favour of clarifying, achieving and delivering a scientific consensus. So there's still a dominant linear model which presumes we need to get the science right as the necessary basis for determining what needs to be done. So, this assumes that, of course, that we are all in it together, that we trust the science, and that this is in our hands and we operate as discrete individuals. So the question is, where is the politics of climate change? And I'm very interested in Tony Giddens's relatively recent book where he says that we don't have a politics of climate change. So we don't have a developed analysis of the innovations that need to be made if our aspirations in climate change are to become real. Whereas society, and I think John Urry's very recent book, Climate Change and Society, I would recommend it as reading, which came out 2 months ago, John, in May or sometime. He talks about how how society is implicated within the practices and processes that generate the warning and which contribute to these potentially catastrophic consequences. But the question that I want to pose really is to do with culture. So while Giddens turns to the state, John turns to the social as the vehicles to generate the possibility of a post-carbon society. What I want us to think about is the role of culture. So the role that culture, and in particular cultural narratives and storylines, play in ameliorating and understanding environmental change. And in particular, and Catherine Yosef sent me very kindly a recent paper, so she's done some of this work in advance, which is great, but it's really to do with the ways that cultural narratives and storylines might be put to more innovative use as providing the basis and capacity for reimagining life in the context of an uncertain and changing climate, and hence for stimulating new passions. And I want to stick with this notion of passion, new energies, for how humans and non-humans can enter into politics. So our focus is very much on questions around culture. Now, of course, this isn't to say that there isn't already a culture of climate change, and in a sense, when you look at how the idea of climate change is told, the stories and narratives that surround it, there is a set of commonplaces, of stock images that tend to predominate. So the first one is the Earth is fragile. And again, there's a lovely project that Bron and John were involved in, looking at these sort of circulation of global images, the sense of the world as one that's fragile, one which demands a sense of humility in relation to that, one of which we need to handle with care. So that's the first part of the, as it were, the story of climate change. The second is that this is in peril, and there are icons of smokestacks, of belching out pollutants, and they're very interesting with this rebadging of carbon dioxide as a pollutant, which I think is a very interesting aspect to begin to think through. More smokestacks, the Earth is dying, etc., etc. Bleached corals, another iconic retreating glaciers, burning or dying forests. The polar bear, and Catherine, I think, has talked a lot about polar bears, is a very interesting icon, as it were, of climate change, this majestic animal whose habitat is disappearing with the loss of sea ice in the Arctic, and lots more polar bears for Catherine here, and more polar bears. And a variation, we have the sea lion, where it's the same story, but a variant on it, where the sea lion is also seen as in danger because of a changing climate to do with changing fish patterns and such like. And of course there is as it were, uncontrovertible scientific evidence that it seems to back that up. So the Earth is fragile, the Earth's in peril, the future's apocalyptic, to do with increasing temperatures, the dried Earth, more dried Earth, more hurricanes and such like. So these are kind of, as it were, stock images. And finally, with the injunction that the future is in your hands. So there's lots of pictures of hands and globes, and more hands and globes, and more hands and globes. So this is the kind of, as it were, the current iconography of climate change, with this sense that you know, individually, you control climate change. This is, I think, from the EU, that you have, you know, so it's up to you in terms of driving less, or turning your lights off, or recycling, or turning things down, or walking, or such like. Okay, so I'm of course a little bit negative here. Catherine is far more positive, and quite rightly so. So she looks in a very nice paper, Climate Change in the Imagination, which, is it out, Catherine, or is it?
Yeah, it's online first.
Online first, yeah. So for online, in what journal was it?
It's in Wires.
Wires, right? Okay, I'd never heard of it, but anyway, it's interesting.
You probably know more about it.
Yeah.
I've just stepped down some of the editors.
Oh right, sorry, Harry. I should have known about it. Anyway, my ignorance, nothing there. Anyway, what Catherine says in this paper is that there's been scant attention to how futures could be deployed as a creative method of environmental imagining, and in particular the role, and she's very interested in the arts and humanities, and the role of the arts and the humanities to contribute to future narratives. So there's a more of a positive rendition of these new imaginaries, and as providing, as it were, narrative resources for thinking about a world in which there is climate change. You know, what it's like to live in a post-apocalyptic future. You know, the road being, you know, a wonderful, relatively contemporary example, and there are many more. And very interesting things about the role of science fiction, that as a particular narrative form, that in a sense that's slightly outside scientific knowledge, but maintain at the same time a relationship with that. So it's a form of helping us to imagine. More interesting things about Ice Course. I hope, but she talks about the Ice Core as the modern H.G. Wells time traveller, as helping us imagine a voyage through time, again with the focus on imagination. What I want to say is that even though that I think these are very interesting points, at the same time I think there are some fundamental and perhaps epistemic problem with this dominant framing of climate change. And these concern whether these cautionary tales that play in visual images of impending doom leave citizens with a gloomy aestheticism, with a future of self-restraint and mere survival. And here I'm informed by a book that I like a lot. I haven't heard many more, but Bruno Latour likes it. So anyway, Bruno and I like this. Anyway, it's one I would recommend, because in a sense, what this book tries to do is to actually develop both a critique of dominant storylines and to think how another might be, And the argument that Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schoenberg say is that there's been a continuity, ever since Silent Spring, in terms of, as it were, environmental writings. They say that where they wrap the latest scientific research about into a tragic notion of tragedy here, that conjures nostalgia for a nature while prophesying ever worse natures to come, unless human societies repent for their sins against nature and work towards a harmonious relationship with the natural world. And as a lot of research has shown, this kind of narrative has tended to be more likely to engender fatalism, survivalism, disconnection, and I think most interestingly, thin bonds as opposed to thick bonds. So thin connections. There's a very interesting chapter in this book where they talk about, well, why is it that if you're in the States that there's such thick connections through the new Protestant evangelical churches, and could we not learn a little bit from there? Which is sort of interesting. You have to get into an American mindset, but once you're there, it's a very interesting argument indeed. And I think the important thing is where is the positive vision of living with climate change? And that's, I think, the point that I want to return to. Where is the positive vision of life with climate change? So this is the context, the context for the research conversation, and to begin to ponder why the need for new storylines, if at all, where they're going to come from. I think it's a very interesting question, where they're going to come from. How will they be energized, okay? And what role of any is there for innovative forms of public engagement? And how might this itself lead to help the setting of new forms of research? A storyline, well, I'm incredibly unsystematic in how I'm thinking about storylines, but this is how Martin Heyer, who's far more kind of considered in his approach, talks about a storyline. So a storyline is a condensed statement that summarizes, it brings together a number of complex narratives. Somebody uses a shorthand. It can allow, it's got a sort of a latitude to allow conflicting interests to come together in what he probably would call a discourse coalition, I would imagine, and it's often used to guide a policy process. So it's premised on certain forms of narrative resources, and it's the narrative basis of that we're particularly interested in. So in the Breakthrough book, this is one source of inspiration, where there's an attempt to move beyond what they call, very nicely, move beyond the limits of limits. Okay, to move beyond the limits of limits, which in their sense has paralysed environmental politics, this idea of limits, of doing less, of stopping, of regulating, or whatever else of this sort of backward-looking sense. The other aspect, which I think is extremely interesting, is there's a lot of sort of psychosocial, emotive appeal. So how do you energize narratives? How do you unleash, in their words, the courage, energy, and moral enthusiasm to encourage the new threats, given that the old storylines are seen to paralyze rather than to energize? So that's a source of inspiration there. For them, there are stories of overcoming. So this is where they say it's from the death elements of the political possibility, but this sense of celebrating what we have overcome to be as we are, well dressed, well catered for, in nice places, well, relatively speaking, John, I know, with the 7 billion of us all sharing a planet and, wonder and all the rest of it. So there are stories of what we've overcome as opposed to the horrors that we now have to face. And for them, they say a new politics requires a new mood, one appropriate to the world we hope to create. It should be a mood of gratitude, joy and pride, not sadness, fear and regret. So that's one opening, I think would be the word. Another one, you see the Zen inspiration here. Okay, so stories of enchantment. And here I'm very interested, and recently come, a lot of people here know her work much better than I do, but the work of Jane Bennett, who talks beautifully, actually, writes very poetically about enchantment, and I think this is the sort of premise for the kind of approach that she adopts. So popular psychological wisdom has that you have to love yourself before you love another. My story suggests you have to love life. Okay, you have to love life before you can care about anything. The wager is that to some small but irreducible extent, you must be enamoured with existence and occasion, even enchanted in the face of it, in order to be capable of donating some of one's scarce mortal resources to the service of others. So hers are about stories of enchantment. It's a beautiful deconstruction of disenchantment tales, a lovely kind of a demolition. Well, it's not enchanted enough, but a sort of a way of scrutinising, of critiquing disenchantment tales, from Weber to what were the other three? Blumenberg, Hans Blumenberg, yeah, and Simon Critchley as well. So very nice work indeed. And in its place, I suddenly realised I'm a vitalist. I didn't quite know I should have talked to Robert before, but anyway, I think I'm a vitalist. So anyway, but her notion of vital materialism, which she thinks as having significant advantages. One, in terms of actually seeing the enchantment that exists in life, seeing our connections with us, seeing the vitality of matter, appreciating the kind of entanglement that exists between the human and the non-human, seeing the world governed by emergent rather than the linear or deterministic causality, and seeing, and this is for me, it's seeing ourselves as not fully or exclusively human. And she uses the example of the elbow. And here's what she says: my flesh is populated and constituted by different swarms of foreigners. The crook of my elbow, for example, is a special ecosystem, a bountiful home to no more than 6 tribes of bacteria. They're helping to moisturize the skin by processing the raw fats it produces. The bacteria in the human biome collectively possess at least 100 times as many genes as the mere 20,000 human genome. In a world of vibrant matter, it is not enough to say we are embodied. We are rather an array of bodies. If more people marked this fact more of the time, if we were more attentive to the indispensable foreigners that we are, would we continue to produce and consume in the same violently reckless way? So I thought it was a really interesting sort of thought. So that's my second source of inspiration. The third one is Bruno Latour, and in terms of what he calls stories of attachment. So Latour suggests that the energizing, as it were, what is it that sustains and energizes modernism, has been sustained not simply through a belief in science, i.e. through science nature will be revealed, but in the ways this has been coupled with a dazzling array of psychosocial emotions, what you call juvenile enthusiasm, indifference to the past, risk-taking, frontier spirit, optimism. And in a review of Breakthrough, the book I just mentioned, he situates the argument within the philosophical imperative of breaking through the limits of the notion of limits as a precondition to unleash the same type of courage, energy and enthusiasm that's necessary to overcome the new threats. So Latour's alternative narrative derives from the recognition that while science has promised emancipation, while it's promised the sense that through science we can be free from nature, from the past, from contingency, from emotion, from subjectivity, that while it's done that, the material effects of science has been a continuous movement towards a greater level of attachments of things and people as an ever expanding scale and ever increasing degree of intimacy. So Latour's dream of emancipation is not a conversion from hubris to aestheticism, okay, which he sees as the environmentalist fallacy, but an ethic that follows through the unexpected consequences of action all the way through into the attachments and imbroglios. So for Latour, the question is not to stop innovating, creating, intervening, but to do in accordance with what you might call ancient or Christian virtues. So in his words, as a good Catholic, is he a good Catholic? I think he's a good Catholic, with love and patience and kindness and humility. The sin, according to Latour, is not of using technology to master nature, but that of presupposing that through mastery science can absolve themselves entirely from worry or care of future unexpected consequences. So, and he uses an example, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where the sin was less the creation of a monster, whatever, but it was the abandonment. It was the abandoning the creation. That was the sin, and the instruction that gives to Latour is we cannot abandon, but we need to care. Like Atlas on our shoulders, we have to take responsibility and care for our creations all the way through. So it's true that we always take our master creation from God. Well, the Christian God at least is not a master that masters anything in terms of this first emancipatory modernist view of the word, but who on the contrary gets folded into, implicated with and incarnated into his creation, and who is so attached to his creation that he is forced to say that the sin is not to wish to have dominion over nature, but to believe that this dominion means emancipation and not attachment. So for the injunction to love technology. Okay, so that was the final kind of encounter is with some of our own work, which we did looking at public responses to emerging nanotechnologies, and we were very interested in the narrative resources that people bring to bear on constructing their own concerns. And here we were very interested in terms of thinking through stories of nature and the sacred. And we identified what were 5 narratives that tended to come again and again, which we called names and tried to situate in a particular context. So we had the narrative of Pandora's box, of things getting out and not being able to put them back again, of messing with nature, this idea that nature has a tacit sense of order and integrity that should not be messed with. And that perhaps the most interesting one, that you should be careful what you wish for. You might want to look young forever and all the other promises that technology brings, but actually is this really the kind of world that we want to wish for? I won't talk much about those, but just to say that in antagonism to this emancipatory model of this modernist emancipatory model of techno-science, what we found was actually 2 sets of narratives. Ones which were properly modern, to do with questions around alienation, not being involved, ones around exploitation, which was around of inequalities, but actually a tripartite set of concerns which we thought were much more ancient in a significant way, that touched on these stories, these dilemmas, which really have been of fundamental concern since the time of the Greek and the Bible, around desire, the question of evil, the question of the sacred. So I'll just stop with some closing remarks. So up to now, the proposition, the argument is that the old stories around the environment and climate change perhaps not working, new stories are required. this sense, and this is where I think that the tour papers are so interesting. They at the same time require the same kinds of energies and passion as the modernist story of liberation. So that's what we need to think about. Where we might look for it, well, I've suggested 4 places that might be of some interest. Narratives of overcoming, narratives of enchantment, narratives of attachment, responsibility, and narratives around nature and the sacred. And the argument here is that these are importantly latent within culture. Okay? Latent within culture, this is the argument. And thus provide a set of opportunities to actually work with publics and their various kinds of actors to crystallize new agendas. Okay, so that's the opening comments. We now have this is the rest of the day, as I've mentioned it, the events which I've mentioned as well. Importantly, though, what I want to say is we are not simply having these events, but we hope to create a deliberative process which will hopefully lead to a citizens panel being constituted, developing its own energy, meeting, discussing, refining its own challenge, living environmental change, encountering and working with different kinds of academics and presenting at a final policy seminar. And I just want to say one thing here, and that we're very taken with how science funding is moving at the moment, that there is this move, as it were, at a top level, towards directed research, towards research which is meant to represent the grand challenges of tomorrow. And this is a move that's pervading research councils, all of them, to various degrees. And yet the idea of how society is constituted is something that has up to now been taken as a given. So this is another, as it were, background rationale for why we're so interested and energized by this process. Just to introduce Ingrid Sylvester, who is a local artist who has very, very kindly offered to come to this event and possibly to others to kind of give a kind of a visual expression of the day. So Ingrid has got her pastels and will be painting the conversation, and perhaps she'll be talking a little bit about this about 4 o'clock as well. We also have a sound installation promised by Trevor Wishart. So this is in partnership with Musicon, which is a university sort of music outfit. We don't know what this is going to be like at all, but I'm sure it'll be fascinating, and Trevor's work sounds wonderful. So there will be a sound installation which will be which we will launch next June in the Botanic Gardens. So we're hoping that this whole process can involve different modes of involvement and engagement. So to finish with these questions, I just put them on here again, but perhaps before I do that, and before we have John, if there's any questions now, I'd be very happy to take them, but if not, then I'd be even happier for John to start. So are there any questions or points of clarification or stuff here? Brilliant, excellent.